The story of the Howard family of shipbuilders goes back more than 200 years to the pioneering days of river travel. For 3 generations, the Howards were some of the premier steamboat builders anywhere on the inland rivers, and each of the more than 1,100 vessels they launched carried the Howard reputation for speed, strength, and quality construction. The Howard saga began in 1819, when John Howard, a weaver from Lancashire, England, took his wife and their sons, including their oldest, 5-year-old James, across the Atlantic Ocean to the United States. Landing in New York after a 6-week voyage, the Howards eventually made their way westward to Cincinnati on the banks of the Ohio River, where John opened a small wool mill. Young James was drawn to the river from an early age, and as a teenager he apprenticed with local shipbuilder William Hartshorne. Rivers had long been important highways for trade and transportation, but traveling upstream against the current was always a difficult challenge, as moving a boat through sheer muscle power alone was a slow and tiring process. Steamboats changed all of this. The adoption of steam-powered engines in the early 1800s allowed boats to move both upstream and downstream much faster than had been possible before. By the 1830s, steamboats were driving the development and expansion of the country. These boats were naturally in high demand, and their builders often became wealthy men. In 1834, at the age of 19, James Howard left his apprenticeship and traveled down the Ohio River to Port Fulton, Indiana, today a neighborhood of Jeffersonville, across the river from Louisville, Kentucky, where he built his first steamboat, the Hyperion. After marrying Rebecca Barmore, the sister of a short-time business partner, in 1836, James Howard did good business for the rest of the decade, with his boats gaining reputations for speed and strength. Howard-built boats often lasted 10 years or more, twice the average service life of a river steamer in the 1800s. Although the business fell on hard times in the early 1840s during a nationwide depression, their quality of work and good business sense saw them through, and the Howard Shipyard, truly a family business by now, as James brought 2 of his younger brothers on as partners, became known as one of the best and most dependable shipyards anywhere on the inland rivers. After another decade of continued success, the 1860s were a time of change for the Howards, their shipyard, and the steamboat business overall. The Civil War temporarily closed the important markets and business clients found on southern rivers to northern shipbuilders like the Howards. Many Howard-built boats were requisitioned by the navies of both the Union and the Confederacy, and several served throughout the war on the western rivers. Shortly after the war, James Howard brought his 24-year-old son, Edmunds, on as a shipyard partner after the retirement of one of his younger brothers. But the biggest change for the Howards and the steamboat industry at that time was the rise of the railroad, a direct threat to the importance of steamboats in transportation and trade. To compete with the speed and convenience offered by trains, steamboat builders made their vessels even bigger and more luxurious. Some of the most remarkable boats the Howards ever built were launched in the decades after the Civil War. The grandest of these was the steamer J.M. White, launched in 1878 for the cotton trade on the lower Mississippi River. More than 320 feet long, the J.M. White was one of the largest, most luxurious, and most powerful river steamboats ever built. However, James Howard did not live to see her completed. On October 14, 1876, at the age of 62, the shipyard founder drowned after falling overboard from a ferry coming back across the Ohio River. You can still see his grave today in Louisville's Cave Hill Cemetery. After James's death, ownership and management of the Howard Shipyard passed to his son, Edmunds. Born in 1840, Edmunds J. Howard had grown up in and around his family's shipyard. Although he had a lot to live up to, Edmunds proved to be a talented shipbuilder and a savvy businessman. Indeed, The 1880s and 1890s were the most profitable decades the Howards ever saw, a remarkable feat considering that during those years the steamboat industry was beginning to lose its struggle with the railroad. By 1890, the family had grown so wealthy that Edmund's wife, Laura, felt they needed a new home to match their important status. Between 1890 and 1894, Edmunds and Laura had their beautiful 22-room, 15,000 square foot, Richardsonian Romanesque mansion built right across the road from the shipyard, where it still stands to this day as the Howard Steamboat Museum. The mansion was built by the shipyard workers, and its fine construction is a testament to their skill, craftsmanship, and artistry. Much of the detailed woodwork in the mansion, including the beautiful fireplace mantels, was carved by Ernst Hoffmann, a German immigrant who at the time was the shipyard's master carpenter. The mansion was the first home in Jeffersonville to be fully electrified, and modern-day visitors to the museum can still see the dual electric and gas lighting system in the building's original chandeliers. Much of the furniture was bought at the 1893 Columbian Exposition in Chicago, Illinois, and visitors will notice that more than 90% of the furnishings on display at the museum are original to the Howard family. More than just a beautiful piece of late Victorian architecture, the Howard Mansion was also a family home. Edmunds and Laura's sons, Clyde and Jim, both adults by the time the mansion was completed, lived here for a time with their parents and their own families. The memoirs of Clyde's daughter Frances, who lived in the mansion as a little girl in the early 1900s, are one of the best sources we have for what life was like for the Howards around the turn of the century. Although the steamboat industry was in steady decline by the end of the 1800s, Edmunds Howard and the shipyard that bore his family name were still building some remarkable vessels. In 1894, the yard launched the packet steamer City of Louisville, a boat which set speed records for both upstream and downstream runs on the Ohio River, records which still stand today. Perhaps the most interesting business venture during Edmunds' time heading the shipyard was in 1898, when he built 4 steamboats for use on the Klondike River during the Alaskan Gold Rush. This remarkable success continued through the dawn of the next century, and the early 1900s were a very good time for the Howards. Edmunds and Laura Howard both died in 1919, and the shipyard passed into the hands of their sons, Clyde and Jim. However, the steamboat industry now had to compete with both the railroad and the newly popular automobile, a competition which it simply couldn't win. In 1925, Clyde Howard sold his share in the shipyard to his younger brother, Jim. This was 2 years after the Howards had launched the last classic packet steamboat the yard would build, the Cape Girardeau, later known as the Gordon C. Green, which eventually became the precursor to more modern overnight boats like the Delta Queen and Mississippi Queen. Jim Howard and his wife, Loretta, then took on shared management of the shipyard, with Jim leading the shipbuilding and Loretta handling much of the financial business as vice president. Although Loretta came from a working-class background, and Jim was the son of one of the wealthiest families in southern Indiana, the two fell in love soon after they first met and had been married since 1908. Loretta proved to be an astute businesswoman, and it was partially her good financial sense that kept the shipyard going throughout the 20s and 30s. Despite Jim and Loretta's skill and talent, the economic downturn of the Great Depression and damage done to the shipyard during the flood of 1937 put Jim, Loretta, and their shipyard in dire financial straits. The last Howard-built vessel, a diesel towboat named the Frank Costanzo, was launched in 1940. Thankfully for the Howards, the federal government bought their shipyard in 1941, shortly before the United States entered the Second World War. During the conflict, the former Howard shipyard was used to make small vessels like sub-chasers, patrol boats, and landing ships. The hundreds of vessels built at the Jeffersonville yard saw service all across the globe, from the D-Day landings at Normandy, France, to storming the beaches of Iwo Jima in the Pacific. After the war, the yard was sold to private interests and became known as the Jeffersonville Boat and Machine Company, later shortened to Jeffboat, which remained the largest inland river shipyard anywhere in the country until it finally closed in 2018, ending a shipbuilding legacy that went back more than 184 years. As for Jim and Loretta, their 1941 deal with the government left them ownership of the mansion, where they lived as a loving couple until Jim's death in 1956. It was Jim's dying wish for his old family home to be turned into a museum dedicated to steamboat and river history and to his family's important role in that history. Although Loretta was not born a Howard and had married into the family, she made it her goal to see her husband's wish come true, and in 1958, the Howard Steamboat Museum opened its doors for business, with Loretta as its first employee. She lived in a small apartment on the third floor, giving tours to guests and visitors until 1970, when she moved into a different home in Jeffersonville. 1 year later, in 1971, disaster almost struck when the mansion's old boilers exploded and started a fire, but the solid construction that had seen the building through the 1937 flood saw it through the fire as well, and the museum was back open within a year. Loretta Howard continued giving tours of the museum until she died in 1978 at the age of 93, having done wonders to fulfill her husband's wish. Although the shipyard is now gone, and there are few direct descendants of the Howards left in the area, the Howard Steamboat Museum is still open to all who wish to experience the family's legacy and step back in history to the fascinating world of the Steamboat Era. We are a non-profit organization that receives no regularly scheduled federal, state, or local funding, so we would like to thank our members, donors, and visitors, past, present, and future. It's supporters like you who help us keep history alive.